What happens when a late-night talk show host meets a guest who refuses to play by the rules? When carefully prepared questions turn into a battlefield of words, and when the cameras keep rolling as everything spirals out of control? Tonight, we're diving into one of the most explosive moments in late-night television history, where Stephen Colbert found himself face-to-face with a guest who had her own agenda, and it wasn't pretty. Make sure to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because this story gets more intense with every passing minute. The Late Show with Stephen Colbert was running like clockwork that evening. The audience was buzzing with anticipation. The cameras were positioned perfectly, and Stephen had spent hours preparing for what should have been a standard celebrity interview. His research team had compiled their usual stack of talking points, focusing on upcoming projects, charitable work, and light personal anecdotes that would give viewers that perfect balance of entertainment and insight. But from the moment Meghan Markle walked onto that stage, something felt different. The usual warm smile that greeted guests seemed forced, almost mechanical. She moved with a stiffness that Stephen's trained eye immediately picked up on. After decades in the business, he could read body language like most people read headlines. "Welcome back to The Late Show. I'm Stephen Colbert," he began with his signature enthusiasm, turning to face his guest. "And joining me tonight is Meghan Markle, who I'm sure needs no introduction." The applause was polite but measured. Meghan settled into her chair with an air of someone who had somewhere else to be, her posture rigid and her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Thank you for having me, Stephen," she replied, though her tone suggested she'd rather be anywhere else. Stephen, ever the professional, launched into his first question with the kind of warmth that had made him a beloved figure in late-night television. "So, Meghan, you've been keeping busy with various projects. Tell us about your latest endeavors." Instead of the expected promotional response, Meghan's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know, Stephen, I have to say I'm a bit disappointed in how you've framed this conversation already." The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the direction anyone had expected the interview to take, certainly not 30 seconds in. Stephen's eyebrows raised with genuine surprise. "I'm sorry, how so?" "Well, your introduction was rather dismissive, don't you think? Saying I need no introduction, as if my work and contributions are somehow secondary to my personal life. It's exactly the kind of reductive commentary that women in the public eye face constantly." Stephen paused, his mind racing. In his years of hosting, he'd encountered difficult guests before, but never had someone taken offense to what was essentially a compliment. The audience was dead silent now, sensing the tension building. "I certainly didn't mean it that way," Stephen replied carefully. "I was actually trying to acknowledge your prominence and the fact that our viewers are familiar with your work." "Your viewers?" Meghan repeated, her voice taking on an edge. "And what exactly do you think they know about my work, Stephen? Do they know about my advocacy for women's rights? My work with World Vision? Or do they just know the tabloid version of my life?" Stephen felt the interview slipping away from him. This was supposed to be a light, engaging conversation, not a cross-examination. But he'd been in this business long enough to know that the best way forward was often straight through. "I think our viewers are smart enough to appreciate all aspects of your life and career," he said diplomatically. "That's actually why I wanted to talk to you tonight, to give you a platform to discuss the things that matter to you." "A platform?" Meghan scoffed. "How generous of you, Stephen. Tell me, did you offer Prince William a platform when he was on your show, or did you just let him be himself?" The comparison caught Stephen off guard. "Well, Prince William and I talked about his environmental work, his family, his role in the monarchy. Pretty standard stuff." "Standard stuff," Meghan echoed. "And did you question his motives? Did you ask him to justify his existence or explain why he deserved to be there?" Stephen was beginning to understand that this wasn't just a difficult interview. It was something else entirely. Meghan had come prepared for a fight, and she was determined to have one regardless of what questions he asked. "Meghan, I'm not sure where this is coming from, Stephen said, his voice remaining steady despite the increasingly hostile atmosphere. I invited you here tonight because I think you have important things to say. I'm not trying to attack you or question your right to be here. But that's exactly what you're doing, Meghan shot back. Every question you ask carries an implicit assumption that I need to prove myself, that I need to justify my place in this conversation. The audience was completely silent now, some looking uncomfortable, others leaning forward in fascination. This was unlike anything they'd ever seen on The Late Show. Stephen took a deep breath. Okay, let's reset. What would you like to talk about? I'd like to talk about the systemic racism and sexism that pervades every aspect of media coverage, including supposedly progressive shows like yours. The accusation hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Stephen's mind raced as he tried to process what was happening. This wasn't just a difficult interview anymore. This was a full-scale assault on his character and his show. That's a serious accusation, Stephen said quietly. Can you give me some specific examples of how this show has demonstrated racism or sexism? Meghan leaned forward, her eyes blazing with an intensity that made even the camera operators nervous. The very fact that you're asking me to prove it shows how deep the problem goes. You're putting the burden on me to educate you about your own biases. Stephen felt something shift inside him. He'd been patient. He'd been professional. He'd tried to give his guest every opportunity to have a productive conversation. But there was a line, and it was being crossed. Meghan, he said, his voice taking on a firmer tone, I've been doing this job for a long time. I've had guests from every background, every political perspective, every walk of life. I treat everyone with respect, and I expect the same in return. Respect, Meghan laughed bitterly. Is that what you call it when you ambush someone with loaded questions and then act surprised when they defend themselves? I haven't asked you a single loaded question, Stephen replied, his patience finally beginning to fray. I asked you about your projects. That's literally the most basic question. You can ask a guest. The way you asked it was loaded, Meghan insisted. Your tone, your body language, your whole approach reeks of condescension. Stephen looked out at his audience, many of whom were now looking genuinely concerned. He'd prided himself on creating a welcoming environment for all his guests, regardless of their background or beliefs. To have that questioned so aggressively and so publicly was deeply unsettling. I'm sorry you feel that way, Stephen said finally. That was never my intention. Intention doesn't matter, Meghan snapped. Impact does. And the impact of your approach is to diminish and marginalize voices like mine. The conversation had reached a breaking point, and Stephen knew it. But he also knew that millions of people were watching, and how he handled this moment would define not just this interview, but potentially his entire career. Stephen took a moment to collect himself, his years of experience telling him that the next few minutes would be crucial. He could feel the weight of every eye in the studio, from his production team behind the cameras to the live audience sitting in stunned silence. This was uncharted territory, even for someone who had navigated countless difficult interviews. Meghan, Stephen said, his voice calm but firm, I think we need to take a step back here. You're making some very serious allegations about this show and about me personally. I'd like to address them directly. Oh, now you want to address them, Meghan replied, her voice dripping with sarcasm. After years of perpetuating the same tired narratives, now you suddenly care about having an honest conversation. Years? Stephen's confusion was genuine. Meghan, this is the first time you've been on this show. I'm not sure what narratives you're referring to. Don't play dumb, Stephen. Your writers, your monologues, your little jokes about the royal family. You think I don't watch? You think, I don't see how you and your colleagues reduce complex situations to punchlines? Stephen felt a flash of irritation. His monologues were carefully crafted, often taking days to write and research. To have them dismissed as thoughtless jokes was both unfair and insulting. My monologues address current events with humor. Yes, but they're based on facts and they're meant to inform as much as entertain. If you have specific issues with something I've said, I'm happy to discuss it. Specific issues? Meghan laughed harshly. How about the time you joked about palace drama being better than a soap opera? How about when you suggested that leaving royal duties was like quitting a job? You reduced genuine trauma and serious allegations of institutional racism to comedy. Material. Stephen paused, remembering the segments she was referring to. They had been part of his regular coverage of current events, treated with the same satirical approach he applied to all news stories. Those were commentary on public events that were being covered by every major news outlet, Stephen said carefully. Comedy has always been a way to process and discuss serious topics. That doesn't mean I don't take the underlying issues seriously. But that's exactly the problem, Meghan shot back, her voice rising. You get to decide what gets turned into a joke and what doesn't. You get to sit in your comfortable chair and make light of other people's pain because it's entertaining for your audience. That's not fair, Stephen replied, his own voice beginning to carry an edge. I've used this platform to address serious issues countless times. I've talked about racism, about mental health, about institutional problems. Just because I use humor doesn't mean I'm dismissing the importance of these topics. Humor at whose expense, Stephen? When you're making jokes about palace intrigue, who benefits? Your ratings? Your reputation as the funny guy who can make light of anything? It's certainly not the people who are actually living through these experiences. The audience was completely transfixed now. Some were shifting uncomfortably in their seats, others leaning forward with the kind of fascination usually reserved for car accidents. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was something much more raw and uncomfortable. Stephen felt his professional composure beginning to crack. He'd built his career on being able to find humor in difficult situations while still respecting the humanity of the people involved. To have that approach attacked so aggressively felt like an attack on everything he stood for. Meghan, I understand that you've been through difficult experiences, and I genuinely sympathize with that. But you can't come on my show and attack my character based on your interpretation of comedy segments that were never meant to target you personally. Never meant to target me personally? Meghan's eyes flashed with anger. Everything is personal when you're the subject of it. Every joke, every comment, every casual reference adds to a narrative that affects real people's lives. Then maybe you shouldn't have agreed to come on a comedy show, Stephen said, immediately regretting the words as they left his mouth. The silence that followed was deafening. Meghan's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, hurt, anger, and finally something that looked like vindication. There it is, she said quietly, but her voice carried clearly through the studio. There's the real Stephen Colbert, not the carefully crafted liberal host who pretends to care about social justice, the man who thinks that if you don't like being made fun of, you should just stay home. Stephen realized he'd made a critical error. In his frustration, he'd said exactly the wrong thing, playing directly into the narrative Meghan was trying to construct. That's not what I meant, he said quickly. I meant that if you're not comfortable with the format of a comedy show, then maybe we should have discussed that beforehand so we could find a better way to have this conversation. Oh, so now it's my fault for not managing your expectations properly. Meghan's voice was getting louder, her composure completely abandoned now. I'm supposed to call ahead and warn you that I might actually want to have a substantive conversation instead of just sitting here like a good little guest while you get your laughs? That's not what I said, Stephen replied, his own voice rising to match hers. But yes, if you had concerns about how the interview would be conducted, it would have been helpful to know that in advance. Helpful for whom? Helpful for you so you could decide whether I was worth the trouble? Helpful for your producers so they could book someone more compliant? Stephen felt the situation spiraling completely out of control. Every word he said seemed to make things worse. Every attempt at clarification was twisted into further evidence of his alleged bias. Meghan, I'm trying to have a reasonable conversation with you, but you seem determined to turn this into a confrontation. I'm determined to have an honest conversation, Meghan fired back, something that apparently makes you very uncomfortable. You'd rather I just smile and nod and talk about my charity work like a good little duchess, wouldn't you? I'd rather you treat me and this show with the same respect that I've tried to show you, Stephen said, his patience finally reaching its breaking point. Respect? Meghan stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You want to talk about respect? Let's talk about the respect you showed when you booked me on this show just so you could get ratings from the drama. Let's talk about the respect you showed when you decided my life was fair game for your monologues. Stephen remained seated, but his body language had changed completely. The friendly host persona was gone, replaced by someone who was clearly struggling to maintain professional boundaries. Meghan, please sit down. We can work through this. No, Stephen, we can't work through this. Because working through this would require you to acknowledge that your platform comes with responsibility, and you're clearly not ready to do that. The tension in the studio was now so thick, it was almost suffocating. Production assistants were looking at each other nervously, unsure whether they should intervene. The audience sat in stunned silence, witnessing something that felt far too raw and real for television. My platform does come with responsibility, Stephen said, his voice steady but strained. That's why I've tried to be fair and respectful. In this conversation, even as you've attacked my character and my show, fair and respectful, Meghan repeated mockingly. Is that what you call dismissing my concerns and telling me I shouldn't have come on your show? Stephen knew he was at a crossroads. He could continue trying to de-escalate, continue taking the abuse in the name of professionalism, or he could finally draw a line. The choice he made in the next few seconds would define how this interview ended, and how it would be remembered. Stephen looked up at Meghan, who was now standing over him with an expression of righteous fury. The studio lights cast harsh shadows across her face, making her appear almost theatrical in her anger. He could see his reflection in the monitor behind her, and for a moment he barely recognized himself. This wasn't the Stephen Colbert that millions of viewers knew and trusted. This was someone who was being pushed to his absolute limit. You know what, Meghan, Stephen said, rising slowly from his chair. I think I've been more than patient here. I've listened to your concerns, I've tried to address them respectfully, and I've taken criticism that frankly crosses the line from constructive to personal attack. Oh, now you're the victim. Meghan's voice was incredulous. The powerful white man with the primetime television show is the victim here? I'm not claiming to be a victim, Stephen replied, his voice gaining strength. But I am claiming the right to be treated with basic courtesy, which you seem unwilling to provide. Courtesy? Meghan laughed bitterly. You want courtesy? How? About the courtesy of not turning someone's trauma into comedy material? How about the courtesy of using your platform responsibly, instead of just going for the easy laugh? Stephen felt something inside him snap. All the years of careful professionalism, all the training in handling difficult situations, all the diplomatic language he'd perfected over decades in television, it all fell away in that moment. You know what, Meghan? I've had enough. I've sat here for 20 minutes listening to you accuse me of racism, sexism, and professional misconduct based on nothing more than your own interpretation of comedy segments that were never about you. Personally, I've tried to be understanding. I've tried to be respectful. But you've made it clear that nothing I say will be good enough for you. The audience gasped audibly. This was Stephen Colbert as they'd never seen him before, without the carefully constructed persona, without the diplomatic language, just raw honesty. So there it is, Meghan said triumphantly. The mask finally comes off. This is who you really are when you're not performing for the cameras. No, Meghan, this is who I am when I'm being attacked unfairly by someone who came on my show with an agenda that had nothing to do with having a genuine conversation. An agenda? Meghan's voice was getting shriller. My agenda is to hold people, like you, accountable for the damage you do with your words. And my agenda, Stephen said, his voice rising to match hers, is to have honest, respectful conversations with my guests. Something you've made impossible from the moment you sat down. Impossible because I won't just sit here and smile while you make me the butt of your jokes? No. Impossible because you're determined to be offended by everything I say, regardless of my actual intentions or words. The two were now facing each other across the interview space like adversaries in a courtroom, their voices carrying clearly throughout the studio. The audience was completely silent, transfixed by the spectacle unfolding before them. My intentions? Meghan scoffed. Do you think intentions matter when the impact is harmful? Yes, actually, I do think intentions matter, Stephen shot back. Because without considering intentions, every word becomes a weapon, and every conversation becomes a battlefield. Maybe that's what it takes, Meghan replied coldly. Maybe some battles need to be fought. Not on my show they don't, Stevens said firmly. This is supposed to be a place where people can have civilized discussions, where we can disagree without being disagreeable, where we can find common ground instead of just scoring points. Common ground? Meghan's voice was dripping with contempt. There is no common ground between someone who profits from other people's pain and someone who's actually lived that pain. That was the final straw. Stephen had endured personal attacks on his character, his professionalism, and his integrity. But to suggest that he profited from other people's pain crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That's enough, Stephen said, his voice deadly quiet. I've tried to be respectful. I've tried to be understanding. But I will not sit here and be accused of profiting from pain. I will not have my character assassinated on my own show by someone who came here looking for a fight instead of a conversation. So what are you going to do about it? Meghan challenged, her chin raised defiantly. Stephen looked at her for a long moment, then turned to face the cameras directly. When he spoke, his voice was calm and controlled, but there was steel underneath. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to apologize to our studio audience and to our viewers at home. This is not the kind of conversation we try to have on The Late Show. We believe in respectful dialogue, even when we disagree. We believe in giving our guests a platform to share their views, but we also believe in maintaining basic standards of courtesy and professionalism. He turned back to Meghan, who was watching him with a mixture of surprise and anger. Meghan, I want to thank you for coming on the show tonight, but I think it's clear that this conversation has run its course. I'm going to have to ask you to leave. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. In all his years of hosting, Stephen had never asked a guest to leave mid-interview. The audience was stunned into complete silence. You're kicking me off? Meghan's voice was incredulous. You're actually kicking me off your show? I'm ending an interview that has become unproductive and frankly hostile, Stephen replied evenly. You came here with an agenda that had nothing to do with having a genuine conversation, and you've made it clear that nothing I say or do will change your mind about me or this show. This is exactly what I'm talking about, Meghan said, her voice rising again. The moment a woman of color challenges you, the moment someone refuses to play by your rules, you silence them. No, Meghan, the moment someone comes on my show and repeatedly attacks my character and my integrity without cause, I end the conversation. That would be true regardless of who you are or what you look like. Without cause? Meghan's voice was now bordering on hysterical. I've given you plenty of cause. Your own words, your own actions, your own bias. You've given me your interpretation of my words and actions, Stephen corrected. An interpretation that seems designed to create conflict rather than understanding. Security personnel had begun moving closer to the stage area, though they remained in the background, waiting for a signal from the production team. "So this is how it ends?" Meghan said, her voice now containing a note of something that might have been genuine hurt beneath the anger. "You just shut down the conversation when it gets uncomfortable?" "No, Meghan. This is how it ends when someone comes on my show and makes it clear they're not interested in having a conversation at all. You've spent the entire interview attacking me personally, questioning my motives, and making accusations that you can't support with facts." Stephen paused, looking directly at Meghan with something that might have been sadness in his eyes. "I wanted to have a real conversation with you tonight. I wanted to give you a platform to talk about the things that matter to you. But you came here with your mind already made up about who I am and what this show represents, and nothing I could have said would have changed that." Meghan stood there for a moment, seeming to deflate slightly. For just an instant, the righteous anger seemed to fade, replaced by something more vulnerable. But then her jaw tightened again. "Fine," she said finally. "But don't think this is over. People need to know who you really are." "People can judge for themselves," Stephen replied quietly. "They've seen this entire conversation." As Meghan finally walked off the stage, Stephen turned back to the cameras one final time. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of someone who had just been through an ordeal, but had emerged with his integrity intact. "We'll be right back after this commercial break," he said simply. The cameras stopped rolling, and for a moment the studio was completely silent. Then, slowly, the audience began to applaud. It started with just a few people, then grew, until the entire studio was giving Stephen a standing ovation, not for entertainment, but for maintaining his dignity in the face of an unprecedented attack. That's the story of the night Meghan Markle was asked to leave The Late Show with Stephen Colbert. Make sure to subscribe if you want to see more stories like this, and comment below, what do you think Stephen Colbert should have done differently in this situation?